In this lesson, we'll take a look at the female reproductive cycle. So the main model that we're going to use to describe these changes in the female reproductive cycle is known as the menstrual cycle board. We're going to go back to this when we do the female reproductive system and look at the actual structures. Today we want to just take a look at some of the hormones that run the female reproductive cycle. So this board is broken down into a couple of different parts as far as I'm concerned. This whole middle area here is going to represent something known as the ovarian cycle. What we're going to look at is changes that take place each month based on hormones. These hormones are going to have these hormones that are actually produced by the ovaries are going to actually cause changes in the uterus. So what we have in the four corners is a representation of the reproductive organs. This middle structure is known as the uterus, and you can see there's an ovary here, and then there's an ovary over here. Above the ovary is this structure here. This is a tube known as the fallopian tube. We're going to study these structures in much more detail later in the semester when we do the reproductive system. However, what we want to look at is how do the different changes in the ovary cause changes in the uterus. So we're going to see that there's one uterus here, there's another uterus here, here, and here. These are going to be the changes that take place throughout the month. We're actually going to start over here and then follow, kind of almost to like day 14 of a 28-day cycle, and then from day 15 to day 28 over here. So we're just going to kind of go around like that. So let's take a look. What I did was I just kind of blew up the ovarian cycle. What we have over here, this is the end of the previous month. We're going to say there's a perfect 28-day cycle. And then this is going to show the first week, day 7, to second week, which is day 14, right? And then the third week, and then the fourth week. So we're going to look at some of the changes that take place. So what we see inside the ovary, this little yellow structure and little nucleus, this is known as the primary oocyte. For now, guys, the oocyte is like the egg, right? We're going to call it the egg, but in real technical terms, it's the oocyte. If you were to look around these on the microscope, and we did look at these under the microscope, there's a one layer of cells known as follicle cells or follicular cells. Then these are actually known as primordial follicles. These primordial follicles are going to become a primary follicle. The primary follicle is going to become a secondary follicle, which we don't really see here. And then the secondary follicles are going to become a mature follicle known as a Graafian follicle. And if you notice, within these follicles, we always have the oocyte, primary oocyte here, a primary oocyte here. This is still an oocyte, which is going to change the name to a secondary oocyte because it's undergoing meiosis. But we'll cover that more under the reproductive system. We also can tell a mature follicle because the mature follicle has water in it. This water is known as the antrum. So under the direction, so what I did was I just kind of took the right side of the menstrual cycle board. We're going to look at the uterus here and the uterus here, and then we're going to look at this first half of the month as far as the ovarian cycle. We're going to start with the first phase in the uterus known as the menstrual phase or the menstrual flow. If you were to look at the inner of the uterus here, this red represents the tissue and bleeding occurring between days 28 to say day 5 or day 6, the first week of the month. And this flow occurs because pregnancy didn't happen the month before. So for 5 or 6 days, we're going to get this type of bleeding. Now, the changes that take place in the ovary under the direction of FSH, which stands for follicle stimulating hormone. This is the hormone that comes from the anterior pituitary in the female, in this case, and it tells the follicles to start maturing, right? Primordial follicles are going to become primary follicles. Primary follicles will become secondary follicles, which really aren't shown here. And then finally, a secondary follicle near the end of the second week or so is going to become become a mature follicle. So all of that maturation is under the direction of FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. Now, while the follicle is maturing, it is also releasing hormones. So what I did was I just drew these red arrows over this way, and it's primarily releasing estrogens. And what the estrogen is doing is taking the lining here that has sloughed off from the beginning of the month and starting to rebuild it. All right, this is all part of the what we call the proliferative phase, or some people call it the pre-ovulatory phase. But all of the lining in the inner lining of the uterus, which is known as the endometrium, begins to build back up under the direction of estrogen. Okay, so on this side of the board, I do want you to know that the hormone that's going to stimulate the maturation of the follicle comes from the anterior pituitary, and you're going to call it follicle stimulating hormone. It's the perfect name, right? Follicle stimulating. It's stimulating the follicles to mature. That's happening the first half of the month, right? You can see from day 7 to like day 14, which is over here. The second thing I want you to know, the follicles that are maturing are releasing estrogen. That's important because the estrogen starts to rebuild the lining of the uterus, right? We have to get that a little bit thicker just in case there's pregnancy. We need to have a nice thick endometrium for implantation of the zygote. Okay, so that's what's happening the first half of the month. Now, let's take a look at the ovarian cycle of day 14. Again, we're assuming a perfect 28-day cycle. On day 14, there is a surge of another hormone from the anterior pituitary known as luteinizing hormone. I just abbreviated it LH over here. The luteinizing hormone spikes from the anterior pituitary, and that now takes this mature follicle and dispels the oocyte from it. This process is known as ovulation, right? So on a perfect 28-day cycle, on day 14, there's a surge of luteinizing hormone. That luteinizing hormone causes ovulation. The follicle that's left over, because there's a little bit of bleeding, we call corpus hemorrhagicum, right? Hemorrhagicum obviously meaning bleeding. And then here we can see the oocyte, right? Hopefully that will get picked up in the fallopian tube and then head towards the uterus. Okay, so that's what's happening on day 14. It's pretty easy. The things I need you to know: luteinizing hormone stimulates the ovulation. Now, we have a couple different possibilities here. Either conception can take place or conception will not take place. Let's do the first scenario, that conception does take place. So what's going to happen here, guys? This time I just took a picture of the left side of the board. We have the corpus hemorrhagicum, which caused the ovulation, right? Which is the result of ovulation, I should say. So as we now go from day 14 into the third week this way, this corpus hemorrhagicum is going to turn into the corpus luteum. Corpus luteum literally means the yellow body. What's important here, this corpus luteum is going to release massive amounts, high amounts of estrogen and progesterone. And that estrogen and progesterone is really going to thicken the lining of the uterus, the inner lining of the uterus, right? The glands are going to become much thicker, the tissue is going to become thicker, and we want that in case there is pregnancy, right? Again, we need to have a nice thick endometrial lining for the zygote to implant, right? Implantation takes about a week after ovulation. So this corpus luteum, what I want you to know, is producing massive amounts of estrogen and progesterone, which is causing the lining of the uterus to thicken. Now, this corpus luteum will stay viable for at least 2 weeks. If pregnancy did occur, and conception did occur, and a zygote is formed, the zygote will send a message to the corpus luteum by a hormone known as HCG, human chorionic gonadotropin, and that tells the corpus luteum that there was conception, that we do have a zygote, and this will then continue to produce estrogen and progesterone until a placenta is formed. Right? So if the corpus luteum knows that a zygote is there, it's going to continue to produce the estrogen and the progesterone until the corpus luteum, until the placenta forms, and then maintains the rest of the pregnancy. So this is really an important structure for that early pregnancy. If this were to fail, then the pregnancy would fail. So if the female is pregnant, again, then we'll have implantation into the inner lining of the uterus. Let's say there is no conception, then the corpus luteum will continue to produce estrogen and progesterone only for about 2 weeks. At that point, if there is no signal that there's a zygote, a baby, then this corpus luteum will start to disintegrate. It will start to break down and not produce any more estrogen and progesterone, or the levels of estrogen and progesterone will decline. And the corpus luteum then will become the corpus albicans. Again, that corpus albicans only forms if there is no pregnancy. All right, and then estrogen levels are going to diminish, progesterone levels are going to diminish, and what will happen is from the decreased amount of estrogen and progesterone, the uterus here now will go back this way to bleeding, and then we'll get bleeding in the beginning of the next month. Right? Remember those days 28 to day 6 or so, or day 5, we'll have the bleeding. Right? So we end up getting the cycle based on the fact that no more progesterone and estrogen is being produced by the corpus luteum. Right? So this you're going to call the corpus albicans. Okay, so that is our menstrual cycle or female reproductive cycle. What we looked at was the changes in the ovary. Again, I want you to know the follicles, the hormones that stimulate the maturation of the follicles, the hormone that stimulates ovulation, what hormones the follicles are producing. Well, like on this side would be estrogen to thicken up the endometrium. On this side we have estrogen and progesterone. Again, all these hormones that are affecting the ovary are now also going to affect the uterus, right? This is the menstruation. This is the proliferative phase, right? We start to thicken up the uterus. On this side, this is the post-ovulatory phase. This here can even be called the secretory phase, where the uterine lining becomes really, really thick. The glands become set thick. Okay, and that concludes our reproductive cycle of the female.